Let's cut to the chase. Today we're going to be covering one of the most divisive video games ever made, and its divisiveness stems solely from it being a clumsy transition to the Nintendo Wii for one of the greatest video game franchises of all time, The Legend of Zelda. You gotta put yourself in the shoes of Zelda fans in 2010 to really understand what we're even talking about here, as this game is largely affected by its reputation and negative impact. After the incredible likes of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, Zelda leapt to the GameCube with the shocking Wind Waker, which had an initial surprise of its own for its striking visual departure. But its gameplay was so captivating and purely Zelda that fans inevitably welcomed it with open arms. But for those of us who always dreamed of a more Tolkien-style 3D Zelda when playing Ocarina or Link to the Past, we weren't left behind either with the late GameCube release of Twilight Princess. The game released so late in the GameCube's life, it also got an early port to the next system, the Wii, with light motion control integration. No matter how you slice it, a game sporting the name Zelda meant one thing: quality. These were all modern masterpieces, and it seemed like Zelda could absolutely do no wrong. But without counting Twilight Princess as the real next-gen Zelda installment, we were all left waiting and imagining what Nintendo had planned for Link that would once again blow all our minds. It wouldn't be until 5 years after the Wii's release that we would finally see the creation of the true new 3D Zelda, Skyward Sword. But even pre-launch, fans were getting concerned. Not just about another graphical departure akin to the Wind Waker, or the fact that the game used the Wii's motion controls. We saw these elements work well before when we doubted them in the past with Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. Sure, they had us raising our eyebrows, but the real concern was that the game's motion controls seemed so invasive and obtuse, Shigeru Miyamoto himself embarrassingly couldn't even properly demonstrate them in front of a live audience at E3 2010. The problem wasn't the fact that the new Zelda was different or innovative, it was that it didn't even play like Zelda, aside from having zero accessibility options, forcing its players to play it in the uncomfortable waggly arm fashion that Nintendo demanded. But hey, it was Zelda, and we were still gonna give it a try. And by November 2011, we could finally play it for ourselves and evaluate just how grounded our concerns were. In hindsight, we were right to be hesitant, but the real kicker is that we weren't even close to grasping the indescribable depths of disappointment and aggravation that is The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. And with Nintendo's HD re-release for the Switch, featuring numerous updates and changes to the base game, there's no better time than now to revisit this abomination. I can't believe you've been touching it for this long and it hasn't burnt through your hand or anything. I'm gonna tell you up front, if it weren't for my immense love of Zelda and neurotic personality as a completionist, I honestly would have, and probably should have, stopped playing this game after the first hour. Funnily or sad enough, that's what happened to most players. I've seen several polls done online collecting player experiences within the game, and quitting early on is the most common outcome. For a $60 game of a mainline and highly respected franchise, that's almost unheard of. So sure, I found it clunky and awkward, the graphics were ugly, and the mediocre story and its irritating characters were all shoved down my throat, but I kept going, because it's Zelda! And to be completely honest, there are several things I do really like about this game. And to be completely frank, this is one of those few games that will stick with you for a long time, and the way you think about it will continue to change as you experience more games and revisit it. Unfortunately for me, it went from being a bad game to the absolute worst video game I've ever played in my entire life! Now hold on, we'll address all your concerns, but also take a look at what the HD re-release does to address those issues, if anything at all. He didn't even argue with me. When the critical gamer is putting on a straight face after I blatantly accuse a game of being the worst game ever created, you know that we're talking some serious bottom-of-the-barrel crap here. There are worse games out there, but only because being bad is arbitrary and relative to your expectations. And do you know what I expect in a Zelda game? Oh man, hold on tight, this ride's about to get bumpy. Where do I even start? There's no getting around it. These controls are asinine. They're so bad, they all but single-handedly ruin the entire experience. Let's be perfectly clear. Motion controls are not inherently a bad thing. Not having accessibility options for disabled or otherwise frustrated players, however, is. There are plenty of great games out there that do motion controls right and are enhanced by having them. This, however, is not one of those games. But hey, I am the positive gamer. So let's start with a few good things about the gameplay. This still is a 3D Zelda game, inheriting the staples from the past entries, like puzzle solving your way through action-adventure style dungeons and accumulating various utility upgrades to help you in more combat and exploration. Now, where this game deviates from the norm is from its previously mentioned heavily integrated motion controls, as the gameplay and level design were specifically created to cater to this choice. To get this game to even function properly, you'll need to be playing with a Wii Motion Plus, which is basically an upgraded or modified Wiimote to improve its accuracy. Though, honestly, it still isn't very accurate. It's inevitably laggy, but it does allow you to swing the Wiimote in various directions for the game to register. Prepare to do this a lot. Every single sword swing in this game needs to be performed by physically swinging the Wiimote in one of 8 directions. The nunchuck is also sensitive to motion controlling your shield for parries and other movements. I get on paper how this sounded cool, and admittedly, I thought it was at first too. Twilight Princess on Wii had Link swinging his sword with a flick of the Wiimote and aiming his bow and arrows by pointing at the screen, and it only got you dreaming of being even more immersed in the game world by truly wielding the Master Sword and slicing however you wanted and in any direction. How could it all go so wrong, you ask? The problem is this entire game is designed around this gimmick. If you didn't need to slice Deku Babas or shielded bokoblins in particular consistently changing directions in order to even damage them, or spin your arms to solve hokey puzzles, and instead this was Zelda business as usual, then the motion controls would have actually enhanced the gaming experience. But with the game's insistence in being all about waggling a stick first and foremost, the Zelda parts get neglected. Another huge problem with this design concept is its inevitable input lag and unresponsiveness that comes with motion controls. When you press a button, your brain instantly knows that you pressed it, and you feel the button underneath your thumb, and you see an instantaneous response in the game. With motion, you could be moving far past the response window, and you never really know where you're supposed to be or what you're even doing wrong! You'll be recalibrating the Wiimote a lot as the game inevitably loses sync with you, as you swear you swung the sword diagonally, but it kept reading as vertically instead. Sure, it's annoying, but it's the price you've got to pay for playing the Wii version, as there are no other options for accessibility modes at all. The HD re-release on Switch, however, finally adds this feature, allowing you to directionally slice with the analog stick and map the rest of the controls to regular buttons. I cannot understate how this suddenly shifts the game controls from horrendous to playable. But keep in mind, this entire game from start to finish was designed with the intention of players finding the gimmicky motion controls enjoyable. So by playing with buttons, yes, you're making it tremendously less of a headache to play, but you're also completely subverting the game's inherent design philosophy by doing so. It's like playing Duck Hunt with a mouse. So you'd think the conversation would just end there with the gimmicky controls, but unfortunately, Skyward Sword also introduced a lot of other totally unrelated yet frustrating features. So I guess they thought that Link parrying Octorok attacks was too OP, so they added a damage buildup mechanic so overuse would destroy your shield. This adds nothing to the game but needless frustration as your shield keeps breaking deep in dungeons or in faraway places, requiring you to backtrack to Skyloft to either repair or replace it. Ugh. Skyloft. This small floating sky town is unfortunately what you would call a hub area, where basically aside from a couple shops and some underwhelming floating islands, you can access, brace yourself, 3, and only 3 areas to explore. Oh my god, this just sucks in 7 different colors. To make things even lazier, you actually have to revisit these areas multiple times, not just for repeated backtracking fetch quests, but because these areas end up doubling as extra areas you'd expect to be in the game. For example, the Faron Woods get flooded, so now it's an underwater swimming area taking place on the same map. This is simply awful. If you want to make gamers have a huge case of the feel-bads, then drop them into small segmented, disconnected, linear maps in an action-adventure series known for its exploration, and then make them revisit those same maps again later multiple times with marginal differences just to pad out the game because you were too lazy to finish your homework on time and complete your game. And it doesn't help that Skyloft itself is incredibly content barren. Though you do get the ability to fly around on a Crayola duck-faced dodo bird called a Loftwing, with more awful motion controls! What really sucks is just how lifeless this sky world is. This is nothing like Wind Waker's open ocean, which they were clearly going for here. The problem being is there's just hardly anyone to talk to, barely any goodies to find, and all around nothing interesting to do in any direction. We also haven't mentioned Link's limited inventory pouch yet either. So Link can hold up to 8 item pouches by the end of the game, accessed by, of course, a motion control wheel selector. But the real problem with the inventory management is entirely with how it bungles past Zelda game design concepts, and frankly, craps on all of it in favor of being pointlessly cumbersome. So literally everything takes up an inventory slot. 8 pockets for made items and up to 8 for everything else. From your slingshot to your shield to each and every bottle you have to side quest items and even previously non-permanent item upgrades like larger quivers for arrow expansions. All require one of your slots to equip. You're probably wondering how this obtuse limited inventory works in a game all about finding and collecting upgrades. So once again, the designers thought that forcing the player back to Skyloft randomly on their adventure was fun. And that's exactly what you have to do in order to exchange items in and out of your inventory. Need an item you left out? Maybe a second bottle, or that bomb bag upgrade you bought thinking it was a permanent upgrade like every other freaking game, but instead it's another item you've gotta lug around just to utilize! Speaking of backtracking to Skyloft, we should explain how much of an absolute pain this is. You can only fly back up to the floating town at very particular points on the map, and they're seemingly never on your way or in convenient locations. However, the Switch version is compatible with a new amiibo that we've got to talk about. So since Nintendo realized that this part of the game was about as fun as sticking your dick in a wasp nest, they created an incredibly helpful quality of life improvement in the form of allowing Link to teleport back and forth between Skyloft and the ground level where he left. This would be amazing were it not exclusively locked behind an expensive toy add-on as scalper bait. Locking quality of life improvements in a video game behind paywalls is bad enough of a business practice, especially one this direly needed in the base game. But to do it with a product that gets notoriously scalped by price gougers around the world with limited inventory is not only negligent, it's downright predatorily tone deaf. I can only imagine how many Switch players will be unable to use this feature because of this moronic blunder, and will inevitably get stuck in dungeons where they're out of inventory space or missing important items, and instead get forced into backtracking the long way to Skyloft just so they can go back through the dungeon and do it all over again. Speaking of dungeons, I just want to point out how underwhelming they all are this time. Each one is designed around heavy implementation of motion control puzzles, and utilizing the one item you found in that dungeon dozens of times to progress. Some gimmicks are kinda cool, like the time puzzles, but even the boss keys are these awful 3D rotation puzzles you need to fumble around with in order to even use. Even the enemies go from frustrating to downright infuriating over time, like how bokoblins used to just block random directions with bladed weapons, but later on use electrified stun knives that will hurt you for even swinging in the wrong way and hitting their block. When these guys gang up on you, the game ceases any foolish pretense of fun you thought you were having. Sure, the enemies suck, but it's the bosses where this game goes from bad to I just want to go home levels of bad. Many of them are just far more irritating versions of the directional sword blocking enemies, but made worse. Girahim is a motion control nightmare, and I especially hated the skeleton pirate guy you have to push back in these 3 ridiculous ring-out style games of freaking Fruit Ninja. By the way, they even recycle this boss again in a later dungeon, as if it weren't already bad enough. And that's just technically a mini-boss! And even on the main bosses themselves, you can't even so much as experiment and try to fight them without being immediately frozen in place and told exactly what you need to do by possibly the single worst aspect of this entire game, Fee. We joke about Navi from Ocarina being annoyingly chatty, but Navi pales in comparison to the indescribable abomination of game design that is Fee. According to Nintendo, you are stupid. You are helpless, and you need to be led by the hand throughout the entire game bit by bit like a toddler on a short leash at the zoo, because left to your own devices, there's simply no way that in all of your ineptitude could you possibly figure out this game's primitive attempt at puzzles or where to go in this extremely linear game. Fee appears constantly, badgering Link with an endless stream of advice in the most forceful hint system I've ever seen in any video game. 95% of Fee's dialogue should already be painfully obvious to the player as she forcefully interrupts your progress to tell you something redundant and in excruciating, unskippable detail, no less. And it's not just, hey Link, shoot the obvious glowing eyeball on the boss to damage it. It's also, hey Link, this upcoming area is too hot and you will take heat damage going there. Hey Link, you should place a bomb here to blow up this cracked wall. Hey Link, your health is low. Hey Link, here's how you solve the puzzle you just stumbled across and haven't even tried to solve yet. Hey Link, you're on fire. Hey Link, just give me the controller. It doesn't help that Fi's dialogue is also written in a weirdly dry, computerized, analytical fashion, making everything that she has to tell you all the more lifeless. She can't just say how to do something, but she also has to tell you that there is a 98% probability that the present situation will be solved by executing the following appropriate input commands. I'm not exaggerating when I say that sometimes you can't even so much as take 2 steps without Fi constantly pinging in the corner of your screen wanting to tell you something obvious, or outright completely halting your progress altogether, forcing you to listen to what she has to say. And when I say constantly, I mean constantly. Fortunately, Nintendo realized that Fi was the worst backseat gamer in history, and they needed to find a way to shut her up. So their solution in the Switch version was to make most of her dialogue optional, as well as making all dialogue in general skippable. Kinda hard to applaud them for adding a basic feature present in video games since the 80s, but hey, it's a step in the right direction. Unfortunately, Fi's hand-holding doesn't stop there. She's also pivotal in the new dowsing mechanic, where you can select targets like characters or collectibles, and physically point your sword around the screen like the doofus in Shadow of the Colossus in order to point out every little hidden secret the game even has to offer for even the most boneheaded of players. Yes, dowsing practically undermines the entire point of Zelda games, but at least it's a more natural solution for forced motion control integration than Link's awkward sword swinging. When your sword is the Wiimote, Link's entire arm is weirdly controlled by your wrist, like a ragdoll puppet. It looks nothing like swinging something in real life and looks hilariously awkward. Well, there are those sections you have to play entirely without your sword or any of your other tools to prove your worth. Oh my god, the Silent Realm. Have we already said something is the worst part of the gameplay yet? Yes, multiple times. Fine, and this ties for the worst. These forced segments, mandatory for progression, limit Link to having no equipment at all and set him in another repeated version of the same areas he's already explored and require him to collect 15 sacred tears and never once get caught by one of the dozens of patrolling guardians, or else he's forced to start the entire trial all over again. To make matters worse, you're in a rush to gather the tears because each one you find halts the movement of the Guardians for 10 seconds, but it's also a stealth segment, so by going too fast, you'll slip up eventually and have to start the whole thing over again. But going too slow means you'll have an even harder time of dealing with the patrolling Guardians. It's a miserable experience, and you have to do this 4 times in different maps throughout the main campaign. I get that they were inspired by the spirit light collecting in Twilight Princess, but you felt like a predator on the hunt when you overcame those obstacles in that game. This time, you just feel like the only thing being tested is your patience. It's truly awful. To make matters worse, this is nothing like the rest of the game at all. You have no equipment, and it doesn't even find a way to actually test Link to prove his worth like they claim. It was all just a dumb excuse to make puzzles out of the new stamina meter. Oh my god, the stamina meter. It needed to stumble here so it could be properly ironed out in Breath of the Wild, so I won't be too hard on it. But the whole game is just full of bland running and climbing puzzles, where you need to keep touching the glowing green plants to keep going, or else you'll fall, sink in quicksand, or become exhausted and waste your time and hearts. I don't understand how that's supposed to even remotely resemble fun! Most of this game's innovations revolve around limiting or hindering Link in ways like this, and I just can't get behind that design philosophy at all. And that's all on top of the heavy bias toward making absolutely everything imaginable motion control based, which again, I just can't agree with on any level. It also feels like a game that takes pleasure in wasting your time. If it wasn't Fi, then it was the unskippable dialogue, the cutscenes, and the fact that every single time you boot up the game, Link needs to remind you what a rupee is, or any other collectible in the game is every single time you pick one up as if you've never seen it before. Which all gets fixed in the HD remaster, thank God. But how they even considered this to be a remotely good idea in the first place is baffling. Twilight Princess annoyingly did this with rupees before its own HD remaster, but this time it's absolutely everything. The game doesn't respect your time, but more importantly, it doesn't respect your intelligence. It honestly feels like they had zero faith in players finding out even the simplest of things throughout the game, to the extent that they wouldn't even give them the chance to solve puzzles, fight bosses, or so much as pick up a piece of amber without telling them exactly what to do in painfully drawn out, unskippable detail. Kind of like this review so far. Ugh, but that's not even the end of it all. Why do I have to keep drawing on the screen and swinging in angles to hit blocks that hardly qualify as puzzles and prove my worth by collecting glowing balls and music notes over and over again when I just want to play Zelda? And there's no amount of quality of life improvements that can ever fix that. I just wanted to play Zelda! Backing up a bit, the GameCube's Wind Waker and Twilight Princess were both beautiful in their own right for outstanding art directions. Skyward Sword, however, the next generation Zelda, I might remind you, visually looks nothing less than a downgrade of both games' art styles. I guess they wanted to consolidate Zelda's visual identity, which I can understand. Personally, I loved having the cartoony as well as the realistic fantasy looks across the 2D and 3D games. But seeing this odd departure from both at once just resulted in a gross amalgamation that I just can't get behind. And what's with the lipstick? Character models and expressions all look so unsettling in this game, and no matter how long I play it, I just can't get over how uncomfortable it makes me feel. You can say that again. This is your new reality. Anyway, almost like a kick in the teeth, Nintendo released a magnificent Zelda tech demo showing off the graphical potential of the Wii U, depicting Link battling a giant spider boss, a mere 2 months after Skyward Sword released. This demo looks absolutely breathtaking, and coming so soon after Skyward Sword just made those of us turned off by its art direction all the more validated in our disappointment. Yeah, I know graphically it's a little much for the Wii, but that doesn't mean the visual identity of the demo couldn't have been used for Skyward Sword instead. Honestly, I could probably get past a lot of Skyward Sword's heinous gameplay had it actually looked more like this. It's like they made the demo to showcase what the next-gen Zelda should look like, but for some reason I'll never understand what we actually got was this. It's not just Link that looks off in Skyward Sword. It's the characters, the creatures, the enemies, even the user interface, and that god-awful massive Wiimote HUD constantly reminding you of the controls taking up an obscene amount of screen space. Now maybe this is all just some Pavlovian response to my disdain for the gameplay rubbing off on the art style, but I distinctly recall awaiting this game pre-launch and being mostly disappointed with its visuals, and if anything, excited for the gameplay. So take that as you will. Personally, I think the entire game just looks like a hokey, cheap cartoon, and that tech demo did nothing but justify my complaints about the game's disappointing, jarring shift in graphics. The main antagonists are a giant toe monster and a flaming demon of tongue fetishes. I think you're justified in wishing for something a little more Zelda? Yeah, but to be fair, some bosses like the giant scorpion and the multi-sword arm dude are pretty cool. What about the giant squid version of Boo from Monsters, Inc.? You've got to be out of your mind if you even remotely think this looks like a well-designed 3D Zelda boss. So, you go through this whole pirate ship dungeon, which alone is pretty neat by the way, all the while occasional booms and crashes rock the boat, building up to this ultimate battle where you finally reach the bow and face off against frickin' Mike Wazowski. When your graphics and visual identity cause jerks in immersion this frequently, it does nothing but put down the rest of the gameplay, which, as we previously discussed, needs all the help it can get! I will say that the concept and promotional artwork for this game look outstanding. When it came time to make the actual models and animations, I don't know where it all went oh so wrong. It's like this game was cursed or something. But it's not like we don't have anything good to say about it for the rest of this review, right? Okay, so long before the events of the other games, Link, along with an extremely small town of people, live high above the clouds in the floating island city of Skyloft. Nice name. So we're keeping the lipstick, huh? The few people who do live here pretend like their species' survival isn't at stake or anything, and just go about their lives even though all 30 of them make up the last of their kind, and like nobody has families or anything, as if they're all just some magical cartoon characters in a make-believe fantasy world devoid of any real thought or care put into their civilization. Anyway, Link has about as much character as a mailbox like usual, and the entire story just kind of happens around him, or to him, as many characters have drawn out one-sided conversations at him throughout the entire adventure. So we're told that Link and Zelda are childhood friends, because anime. And Link gets antagonized by Groose, an obnoxious schoolyard bully, accompanied by his two nobody lackeys, basically competing for Zelda's attention. But there's no school or responsibilities, of course, because anime, and considering Zelda is the only female their age at all, their entire race is doomed. But for the sake of painfully thick helpings of flirtatious kindergarten romance, the entirety of the plot centers around Link pursuing Zelda. Early on, however, you'll need to jump through a lot of hoops to even get the plot rolling. If you thought the intro to Twilight Princess was long, then I've got some bad news for you. After climbing some boxes, Groose kidnaps your left wing, you get it back, race him in some night training tournament thing, and then after more sappy Zelda scenes than a sane human can stomach, she falls into the clouds below, and Link is met by a floating manifestation of the goddess sword named Thea, guiding him through a dream to finally get a sword. This takes forever, if I didn't emphasize that enough. Thea informs Link that Zelda is still alive, and they'll need to descend below the clouds to the surface world in order to track her down and save her from the evil forces that swallowed her up. So you do just that, and the game now becomes follow Zelda to the next area, get caught up in a battle with the creepy edgelord frogman Girahim, who is also tracking Zelda down but for his own nefarious purposes, and narrowly miss Zelda before she's taken off by a Sheikah servant of the goddess and whisked away to the next area so you can do the same song and dance again. On paper, it's still the same travel from one dungeon to another, collecting the things to do something that lets you collect other things to get to other dungeons, but with a tremendous amount of fluff. I don't know how to put this nicely, but I don't like a single character in this entire game. And believe me, I tried to. If it wasn't the fact that not a single character got even the smallest semblance of a character arc, except for Groose, though inconsequential as it was that everyone's dialogue and overall presence is just unlikable. Aside from no one giving me the impression of being remotely believable in terms of the context of this world, with only the bare bones characterization being fleshed out, I get the impression that the characters are all living in the shell of an unfinished project due to how ambitionless they all are. And maybe how they all do nothing but nag me over fetch quests. Zelda character and stories don't need to be grand, or even great, but they do need to reflect and radiate the objective thematic design of the world. And the characters in Skyward Sword just make me want to stop playing, either out of boredom or out of their off-putting natures. Anyway, after missing Zelda for a third time, a giant walking testicle monster called the Imprisoned breaks loose, where you'll need to stop it in the first of many boss encounters where you stab its toes and trip it until it gives up. Ugh. So this thing is what Girahim is trying to revive, his master Demise, who needs Zelda's power to revitalize himself due to her being a living incarnation of the goddess Hylia or something. So you gotta go gather some sacred flame business by backtracking all over, swatting the testicle monster upside the head with a rolled up newspaper every once in a while, before ultimately collecting all the crap in the known universe, proving your worth for the 1000th time by performing dozens of irrelevant menial tasks, assembling the Triforce, and making a wish to destroy Demise for good, causing Skyloft to plummet to the surface world below. Problem is, Girahim played Chrono Trigger, so cleverly decides to kidnap Zelda and revive his master Demise in the distant past before Link's wish ever happens. Suddenly you get a weird redemption arc for Groose of all people, and out of nowhere, an unfitting yet strangely cathartic horde battle of bokoblins straight out of Dynasty Warriors, and Demise himself summoning his own Dark Master Sword from Girahim. I guess he and Fire like literal blades from Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Yet shockingly, even more uninspired with the generic anime light and dark trope. And if you were expecting some big evil plan exposition here, then you've got your expectations set a little too high. Demise is the literal incarnation of bad guy for bad guy's sake. So after waggling your wrist at him long enough, Demise meets his fate and curses Link and Zelda to perpetual reincarnation to do battle with his evil will throughout the ages endlessly in order to needlessly justify the other games, and this one being the first. Ugh. That's another thing Skyward Sword ruined. Timeline speculation was a big thing before this game, but with the 25th anniversary, Nintendo released the Hyrule Historia, which among many other things, blatantly spelled out the entire franchise's timeline, which, I might add, was completely bogus, being so bad and nonsensical that I've yet to meet a single knowledgeable Zelda fan willing to accept its sheer idiocy. Which we already talked about in length in a video discussing the sheer hypocrisy of this slapped-together timeline that you can check out linked in the description, shameless plug. And with Skyward Sword headlining this disaster and cementing its canonical dominance over all others permanently, as well as shutting down an entire community of avid timeline theorists overnight, this either disappointed fans or outright pissed them off. So sure, the actual story beats in Skyward Sword aren't the real problem. Sure, it's far too long-winded and yet simultaneously bare bones as it is, but it's the fact that it did nothing but damage the reputation of the franchise and soiled its own mythology of the same story being retold throughout the ages in a ridiculous timeline with one fell swoop. It's a fresh turd sitting on top of the entire ice cream sundae that is Zelda. You can't ignore it, and it somehow found a way to seep its way into soiling the rest of the series along with it. Okay, so at least this section should be positive. Hamster listened to well over 100 tracks in the soundtrack, and surely found great Zelda music for our video, right? You found a lot of great Zelda music for our video, right? I can't believe it, but this 3D mainline Zelda game soundtrack kinda sucks. Admittedly, after playing the game, I don't really remember any tracks standing out as memorable or iconic like in the other Zelda games. Outside of the melodies, it directly rips from Link to the Past. The soundtrack is just adequate. It technically does its job as background music and sound effects for a video game. But this isn't just an ordinary video game. It's Zelda! Am I wrong for wishing something for a little more grand, or at the very least hummable? There are a couple tracks I do really like, but keep in mind this soundtrack is enormous. The ratio of great to forgettable music is like 1 to 50. That's just not okay. Most of the music just made me groan and wish it would stop, or reminded me of areas I absolutely couldn't stand as I had to revisit them for the 4th time. The good stuff tends to either get used in one-off cutscenes, or it's yet another Link to the Past theme. Should we give it points for that? You want to give it credit for leaning on nostalgia and reminding you of better games you could have been playing instead? How could this even happen? Twilight Princess and Wind Waker have some of the best soundtracks ever made. Why is this game so much worse than them in every single category? You know, Fee's obnoxious audio peaking ping noise counts towards sound design. Why did I ever buy this game in the first place? Funny you say that, because the next section is... forget Zelda. If you really enjoy games like Wii Sports Resort, then definitely give this game a try, because even Eiji Aonuma admitted Skyward Sword takes more inspiration from that game than it does from any other actual Zelda title, and it certainly plays that way. I cannot, in good conscience, ever recommend a single human being pay $60 for this nearly unplayable abomination, or even so much as sit down and waste dozens of hours of their life wiggling their arms around in frustration, even for free. Just like the Dynasty Warriors spin-off games, this is taking a totally new gameplay philosophy and giving it the Zelda-themed coat of paint. Don't play it just because you thought it was a mainline Zelda game, as you'll inevitably leave it disappointed. But instead, play it solely because you're a fan of motion controls, and the Zelda theme doesn't bother you. It's not even ethical to return it after you realize the mistake you made by purchasing this festering filth, since they'll only sell it back to another poor sap like you, perpetuating the cycle. Be responsible, and throw away your trash. Actually, I think I want that 25th anniversary CD. Hold on though, what about the Switch HD re-release? Sure, paying $60 again is absurd, but assuming they somehow picked it up for free, would you recommend it? Playing the Wii version is like swimming naked in a septic tank. The updates in the HD re-release do their best to subvert what sucks so bad in the original, but they can't truly fix the core problematic game design without a total overhaul or a full-blown remake. So instead of being naked, you're wearing a hazmat suit in a septic tank. Yeah, at least it's a better experience, but you're still just splashing in a tub of diarrhea. The positive gamer in me found little to no joy in The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, giving it my first ever 1 out of 10. Video games are supposed to be fun, but if the only real joy I ever found in this catastrophic waste was after beating it and realizing that I never had to play it ever again, then that's a problem. A big problem. Honestly, if it weren't Zelda we're talking about here, then the game would be at least a 5, but because of the franchise's legacy, its shortcomings and outright failures are all the more disappointing in every single aspect of quality game design. The critical gamer in me still stands by the fact that I've played worse, and can at least appreciate the potential marginal enjoyment to be gleaned in Skyward Sword with a 3 out of 10. My critical score is never about what I like, or even how I feel, but how I believe each game should be fairly recognized by weighing its strengths against its weaknesses. And in that regard, Skyward Sword is a disaster on a monumental scale that gets publicly praised solely for being Zelda. However, if you're playing the Switch HD remaster, the positive gamer in me would raise my score all the way up to a 5 out of 10. This is a well-deserved massive jump for basically fixing a tremendous amount of this game's horrendous mechanics, revealing, for better or worse, that the core game itself is essentially an average Zelda game completely stripped of its gimmick. The critical gamer in me finds the Switch remaster to oddly be subverting its own design philosophy, retaining its score of a 3 out of 10. If you strip the gimmicks out of this gimmick-based game, then what are you even playing anymore? The entire point of Skyward Sword was to utilize motion control-based gameplay, from the enemies, to the dungeons, the puzzles, right down to the user interface. Effectively, the updates in this version encourage the player to not play the game. And why should you? But what do you think? Tell us how your positive and critical sides rate Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword in the comments below. But if you're so nostalgia blind to praise this game just because it's called The Legend of Zelda, then you've got to stop trusting IGN reviews and check out the Philips CDI, because my god, come on now, you're just playing with yourself. Whew, that one was a doozy, but thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe for more, and use the links in the description to nominate future episodes. Thank you to our Patreon members, Atomic Thomas, Cameron, Arrow, Rowan, Erica, Shyam, Sid, and Squat Fam. Boo!